July 28, 1944. Hatfield Aerodrome, England. Geoffrey de Havilland Jr, chief test pilot for de Havilland Aircraft Company, advanced the throttles on prototype RR915 and felt something extraordinary happen. Two Rolls-Royce Merlin engines, specially modified with reduced frontal area, pushed the wooden aircraft down the runway with authority that felt almost violent. At rotation speed, the Hornet, as it had been christened, lifted off with the eagerness of an aircraft half its weight. The flight test that followed made observers at Boscombe Down question their instruments. This twin-engine fighter, constructed primarily from laminated wood and glue, achieved 485 miles per hour in level flight, not in a dive, not with special modifications, just straight and level at 22,000 feet, faster than any piston-powered fighter Britain had ever produced. The Air Ministry representatives watching the demonstration understood immediately what they had. The Hornet represented the absolute pinnacle of piston engine fighter design. Everything de Havilland had learned from the Mosquito, refined and perfected. Its performance exceeded contemporary jets in every category except pure top speed. Test pilots described its handling as rocket-like, its roll rate as extraordinary, its range as unprecedented for a fighter. There was just one problem. The calendar read July 1944. The war in Europe would end in 10 months. Japan would surrender 13 months later. And the Hornet, this magnificent aircraft built specifically for long-range operations in the Pacific, wouldn't enter squadron service until March 1946, 5 months after Japan's surrender. This is the story of an aircraft that arrived 1 year too late, of engineering brilliance defeated not by enemy action, but by simple timing, and of how Britain built the fastest piston fighter in the world, just as the jet age rendered such achievements obsolete. The story begins not in 1944, but 2 years earlier, when the war's trajectory looked entirely different. In late 1942, de Havilland's engineering team, led by R.E. Bishop, looked toward what everyone assumed would be a long, grinding campaign against Japan following Germany's eventual defeat. The distances in the Pacific theater were staggering. Island bases separated by thousands of miles of ocean. Japanese positions scattered across an area larger than Europe. Allied commanders needed fighters capable of escorting bombers on marathon missions, loitering over combat zones for hours, striking targets deep in enemy territory. The Mosquito had proven wooden construction worked brilliantly, but its two-man crew and bomber-oriented design weren't optimal for pure fighter work. Bishop proposed something more focused, a single-seat fighter exploiting every lesson learned from the Mosquito, sized for one purpose: dominating the Pacific Air War that Britain expected to fight alongside America for years to come. The initial concept, designated DH-101, envisioned twin Napier Sabre engines producing 2,200 horsepower each. The specifications were aggressive: range exceeding 2,000 miles with drop tanks, speed around 470 miles per hour, 4 20mm cannons, provisions for bombs or rockets, an aircraft that could fly from Darwin to Tokyo and back if necessary. But Napier was swamped, supplying Sabres for Hawker Typhoons and Tempests. The engines simply weren't available. Bishop's team pivoted to the Rolls-Royce Griffon, then reconsidered, and ultimately settled on specially modified Merlin engines with reduced frontal area, the same basic power plant that had proven itself in Spitfires and Mosquitoes, but optimized for the Hornet's requirements. By the end of 1942, de Havilland had completed a full-scale mock-up at their Hatfield facility. The aircraft that emerged looked like a Mosquito that had been to finishing school, smaller, sleeker, more refined. Where the Mosquito measured 44 feet long, the Hornet spanned just 37 feet. The fuselage was extraordinarily slim, the twin engines tightly cowled, every surface optimized for minimum drag. The Air Ministry inspectors who examined the mock-up in early 1943 were impressed, but not immediately convinced. Britain's resources were stretched impossibly thin. Fighter production focused on Spitfires, Typhoons and Tempests for the European War. Bomber Command needed Lancasters and Mosquitoes. The ministry wasn't looking to fund speculative projects for a Pacific campaign that might not materialize for years. De Havilland pressed ahead anyway as a private venture, gambling company funds on what Bishop was convinced would eventually be needed. The project sat in limbo through spring 1943 while the Air Ministry debated priorities. Finally, in June 1943, Specification F.12/43 was issued, formally sanctioning development of what was now designated the DH-103 Hornet. An order for 2 prototypes followed. 13 months later, on July 28, 1944, RR-915 flew for the first time. The speed trial that achieved 485 miles per hour wasn't a fluke. Follow-up tests confirmed the Hornet's extraordinary performance. It could outclimb contemporary fighters. Its rate of roll exceeded anything in RAF service. Range with drop tanks approached 3,500 miles, more than sufficient for Pacific operations. Test pilot Eric Brown, one of the most experienced aviators in British service with 487 different aircraft types in his logbooks, flew the Hornet and delivered an assessment that bordered on poetry. For aerobatics, the Sea Hornet was absolute bliss. The excess of power was such that maneuvers in the vertical plane can only be described as rocket-like. Even with one propeller feathered, the Hornet could loop with the best single-engine fighter. In my book, the Sea Hornet ranks second to none for harmony of control, performance characteristics, and inspiring confidence in its pilot. Brown's verdict carried weight throughout the RAF. This wasn't marketing hyperbole. The Hornet genuinely represented something exceptional, the absolute peak of what could be achieved with piston engines and wooden construction before jets rendered the entire category obsolete. The Air Ministry ordered production in late 1944. Contracts went out for 60 Hornet F.1 fighters as initial equipment for squadrons intended for Far East deployment. De Havilland's Hatfield plant established assembly lines. The first production aircraft rolled out in February 1945, delivered to RAF Boscombe Down for pre-service evaluation. And then the calendar became the enemy. May 8, 1945. Germany surrendered. The European war ended with Hornets still working through final testing. Production accelerated, but operational squadrons hadn't received aircraft yet. The Pacific War continued. Allied planners expected Japan to fight until 1946, possibly into 1947. Invasion of the home islands would require every available resource. The Hornet seemed perfectly positioned. Long-range escort for B-29 raids. Strike missions against Japanese shipping. Fighter sweeps over enemy airfields. Everything the aircraft had been designed for was about to happen. RAF squadrons in Southeast Asia prepared to receive Hornets, replacing war-weary bow fighters and Spitfires with this cutting-edge fighter that outperformed anything Japan could field. Then, August 6th and 9th, 1945, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. August 15th, Japan's surrender. The Pacific War ended before a single Hornet reached operational status in the theatre it had been built to dominate. Number 64 Squadron at RAF Horsham St. Faith became the first unit to receive Hornets in March 1946, 7 months after Japan's surrender. These magnificent fighters, capable of 472 miles per hour and 1,480-mile range, arrived to patrol peaceful British skies. Their mission shifted from long-range Pacific operations to intercepting the non-existent threat of Soviet bombers that wouldn't materialize for years. The timing couldn't have been worse. The Gloucester Meteor jet fighter had already equipped RAF squadrons in 1944. The de Havilland Vampire jet would follow in 1946. These aircraft were slower than the Hornet initially, less maneuverable, shorter ranged, but they represented the future in ways no piston fighter could match. Consider the brutal arithmetic. From concept to first flight, the Hornet consumed 21 months. Not particularly slow for wartime aircraft development, but not fast enough given when the program started. Had de Havilland begun in 1941 instead of 1942, Hornets might have entered service by mid-1944, providing a full year of Pacific combat operations. Instead, development timing meant the aircraft missed the war entirely. The economic calculation was equally stark. Britain had invested substantial resources, approximately £2.8 million across the entire program, developing and producing an aircraft specifically optimized for a theatre that no longer existed. Each Hornet F1 cost roughly £15,000 to manufacture, reasonable for such a capable fighter. But reasonable assumes you actually need the capability it provides. Compare that to the Gloucester Meteor. Early production jets cost approximately £20,000 each, more expensive than Hornets, but they were jets. They represented technology Britain would need regardless of whether a war was currently happening. Development costs for the Meteor program totaled approximately £4 million, money spent creating capability that would remain relevant for decades. The Hornet, by contrast, was obsolescent before it entered service. Not because it was inferior, it wasn't. The aircraft that could outturn, outclimb, and outrange contemporary jets was genuinely extraordinary. But it was a Piston fighter in the dawn of the jet age, an aircraft optimized for a specific war that had already ended. The operational history tells the story of an aircraft searching for purpose. Number 64 Squadron received their Hornets in March 1946 and flew training missions, air defense patrols, occasional air shows where the Hornet's spectacular performance wowed crowds. In September 1949, Flight Lieutenant H. Peebles flew a Hornet from RAF Bovingdon to Gibraltar, averaging 357.565 miles per hour and setting a British point-to-point record. 3 days later, Group Captain A.P.C. Carver flew the reverse route, averaging 435.871 miles per hour, breaking the record again. These achievements made headlines. They demonstrated the Hornet's capabilities. They also emphasized how thoroughly peacetime had arrived. RAF fighters were setting speed records on Mediterranean routes instead of fighting for their nation's survival. Eventually, purpose did find the Hornet, though not the one it had been designed for. The Malayan emergency erupted in 1948, pitting British and Commonwealth forces against communist insurgents in the Malayan jungle. Number 33, 45, and 80 squadrons deployed to Southeast Asia with Hornet F.3 variants, upgraded versions with increased fuel capacity, and strengthened wings for ground attack work. Here, finally, the Hornet performed the long-range strike missions it had been built for. Armed with rockets and 1,000-pound bombs, Hornets could loiter over target areas for 2 hours, providing persistent air support that other aircraft couldn't match. The tropical environment that destroyed many aircraft left Hornets relatively unaffected. Their wooden construction handled heat and humidity better than metal airframes. The Merlin engines, specifically chosen with Pacific operations in mind, performed flawlessly in conditions that challenged other power plants. Number 45 Squadron's Hornets, based in Singapore, flew 4,500 operational sorties over 5 years during the Malayan emergency, more than any other squadron in the Far East Air Force. The aircraft proved reliable, accurate, and capable. Pilots praised its handling, its endurance, its ability to carry heavy weapon loads into small jungle clearings and deliver them with precision. This was useful work, important work, but it wasn't what the Hornet had been built for. Bombing communist insurgents in the Malayan jungle wasn't escorting B-29s to Tokyo or engaging Zero fighters over the Pacific. The aircraft was performing ground attack missions that could have been handled by less sophisticated, less expensive platforms. The final Hornet operational sortie flew on May 21, 1955. exactly 10 years and 21 days after Germany's surrender. By mid-1956, all Hornets had been withdrawn from RAF service, replaced by jet-powered de Havilland Venoms and other modern aircraft. The entire operational lifespan lasted 9 years, with only the final 3 spent in actual combat operations. Production numbers tell their own story. De Havilland built approximately 383 Hornets total across all variants, 181 for the RAF, 202 Sea Hornets for the Fleet Air Arm. Compare that to 7,781 Mosquitoes or 20,351 Spitfires or 7,377 Lancasters. The Hornet entered production just as Britain was desperately trying to shift resources from war production to economic recovery. The Sea Hornet fared slightly better. The Royal Navy needed carrier-based fighters, regardless of whether a war was happening. Number 801 Naval Air Squadron received Sea Hornet F-20s in June 1947, operating from carriers in the Mediterranean and Far East. The aircraft's long range made it ideal for patrol work, its heavy armament suited for anti-shipping strikes. But the Navy was simultaneously receiving jet fighters, Sea Vampires and Sea Venoms that, while slower initially, required less maintenance and represented the future of naval aviation. The Sea Hornet equipped 14 Fleet Air Arm squadrons over its service life, a respectable showing but far from the mass deployment originally envisioned when the Pacific War still raged. The night fighter variants, Sea Hornet NF-21s equipped with radar, found niche roles in the 1950s, serving with Fleet Requirements Units at Malta and West Wales. These aircraft trained radar operators and provided realistic target simulation for naval exercises. Useful, certainly, but again, not the high-intensity combat operations the Hornet's capabilities were intended for. By 1956, the last operational Hornets were gone. The wooden wonder that could outperform early jets in almost every category except pure speed had served barely a decade. Aircraft that survived withdrawal were placed in storage, where British weather attacked the wooden airframes with devastating efficiency. By 1957, deterioration had progressed so far that most stored Hornets were simply scrapped. Today, not a single complete Hornet survives. A forward fuselage section has been reconstructed from scattered components, representing the only physical remnant of Britain's fastest piston fighter. One Sea Hornet is reportedly under restoration in New Zealand, though completion remains uncertain. The comparison to aircraft that succeeded tells the complete story. The Gloucester Meteor, entering service in 1944, flew operationally until 1961 and served as a trainer until 1982, 38 years total. The de Havilland Vampire served from 1945 to 1966 in British service, then continued with foreign air forces into the 1990s. Even the Supermarine Spitfire, entering service in 1938, remained operational until 1954. The Hornet, 9 years from first squadron service to complete withdrawal, not because it was flawed, not because it was ineffective, simply because it arrived 1 year too late for the war it had been designed to fight, making its extraordinary capabilities largely irrelevant. The financial accounting is brutal. Britain invested approximately £2.8 million developing and producing 383 Hornets. Those aircraft flew perhaps 50,000 operational hours total, generous estimate, before withdrawal. That's roughly £56 per operational hour, astronomical by 1950s standards. The Vampire program, by comparison, generated hundreds of thousands of operational hours across decades of service, making its development costs trivial when amortized across actual use. The strategic opportunity cost was equally significant. The resources devoted to Hornet development and production, engineering talent, factory space, raw materials could have accelerated jet fighter programs that Britain desperately needed. The Hawker Hunter, de Havilland Venom, and Gloucester Javelin all faced development delays partly because resources remained tied up finishing programs like the Hornet that had been overtaken by events. This isn't revisionist criticism, it's recognition that timing in warfare matters as much as capability. The Hornet was objectively superior to most Piston fighters ever built. Eric Brown's assessment wasn't hyperbole. Test after test confirmed extraordinary performance. But launching a Piston fighter development program in 1942, with first flight in 1944 and service entry in 1946, meant the aircraft missed its war by 12 months. Had development begun 1 year earlier, Hornets might have equipped RAF squadrons in the Pacific by late 1944, providing 18 months of combat operations before Japan's surrender. That timing would have justified the investment, proven the concept, established combat credentials that would have sustained production. Instead, the Hornet entered service to find its mission had evaporated. The long-range Pacific operations that demanded its capabilities didn't exist anymore. The Japanese fighters it was supposed to dominate had been destroyed or scrapped. The B-29 raids it was meant to escort had ended. The war had moved on without the aircraft specifically designed for it. 11 years after Eric Brown declared the Hornet second to none, all examples were withdrawn from service, their wooden airframes rotting in open-air storage before being unceremoniously scrapped. The fastest Piston fighter Britain ever built, the aircraft that could have terrorized Japanese pilots had it arrived 12 months earlier, had become historical footnotes. The lesson wasn't lost on post-war planners. Britain's subsequent aircraft development programs emphasized rapid development timelines above all else. The English Electric Lightning went from initial specification to squadron service in 7 years. The Hawker Hunter required just 5 years from design start to operational status. Both aircraft recognized that arriving slightly early with good enough performance beat arriving late with perfect performance. The Hornet represented the opposite philosophy: pursue absolute excellence regardless of timeline. De Havilland's engineers created something genuinely special. They pushed wooden construction to its absolute limits. They extracted performance from Merlin engines that surprised even Rolls-Royce engineers. They built an aircraft that test pilots revered and that set records for years after its introduction. But they couldn't change the calendar. The Hornet's first flight came 13 months before Japan's surrender. Too late to effect the war it was designed for. Too early to compete with jets that would define the next generation. The aircraft existed in a temporal gap between Piston and jet eras, between wartime necessity and peacetime economy, between what Britain needed in 1943 and what it could afford in 1946. The final numbers make the case definitively. Production: 383 aircraft. Service life: 9 years. Combat operations: 3 years, exclusively ground attack in Malaya. Records set: several. Wars won: none. The aircraft that should have dominated Pacific skies instead became a footnote, remembered primarily by enthusiasts and aviation historians who recognize what might have been had timing been different. On May 21, 1955, when the last operational Hornet sortie returned from Malaya, the pilot shut down the twin Merlins for the final time. The fastest Piston fighter in British service was finished, retired without ceremony, its potential largely unfulfilled because it had arrived 1 year too late for the only war that mattered. Britain had built a masterpiece. The timing made it irrelevant. That's the brutal arithmetic of military procurement. Sometimes the best weapon is simply the one that arrives when you actually need it, not the perfect weapon that arrives after the fighting stops.